Right, welcome everyone. My name is Clara Marnie. I'm chair of the Design History Society and one of the editors for the Journal of Design History. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to this penultimate session of our seminar series, Representing Crafting Representation. And I'm delighted to have many of you returning from previous sessions, but also some new faces, or names at least, faces hopefully in the discussion at the end of our presentations this evening. I'd like to start our conversation by just really reminding you of the goal of the Society as a charity, as a sort of a central conversation point amongst design historians worldwide, that we do have a lot of different energies that we hope to bring to that community. We are a grant funder. We are a publisher, as I say, of a very impactful journal, the Journal of Design History. We have an annual conference. This year it will be held at the Ishmael Institute of Technology on a theme of design and transience, which I fear is ever more pertinent hour by hour in these volatile times. But we also have a whole set of different sort of outreach and seminar exchange opportunities like this seminar. I just want to draw your attention to 3 forthcoming other activities led by our early career researchers. Our Student Representative Forum have organised a set of reading groups around digital humanities and activism around world languages, which I very much commend to you. They're a set of reading lists and very exciting reflections and exchange ideas. We also, from that, hope to propose a panel for the conference, which will be blind peer reviewed, but hopefully might secure a place. We also have 2 coming seminar series being organised by our DHS ambassadors. The more imminent one is being organised by Alex Bannister and myself, which is looking at hidden histories, gender and design. And then Victoria and I will be organising one around folk cultures and modern everyday objects. The gender series will begin in April. I think the 14th is the 7th of April that we've agreed, and runs through the end of May. It's an 8 seminar series. And then the folk series will begin in June. So we really encourage you to participate in all these forthcoming activities. I also, as I say, very much recommend to you looking at all of the funding opportunities and prizes that we offer. We have essay prizes for undergraduates and postgraduates, but we also have a set of late April deadlines coming up for research funding, exhibition funding for both students and early careers, as well as established researchers in the field. So we hope that you can be part of our community in any number of these ways. And Jenna will just pop into the chat a link tree with details of all this exciting information. But I'm delighted that you've joined us tonight for our theme around craft communities. And it's my great pleasure to introduce the first of 2 speakers. I'm afraid our 3rd speaker has had a family emergency. He's based in Egypt, and just matters arose today that have prevented him joining us, Mohammed. So regretfully, the piece about clay construction will not be presented this evening, but hopefully we might capture that at another point in time. So apologies for that, but we have 2 wonderfully rich papers that I look forward to sharing with you, and thereby a little bit more time for discussion and indeed for the presentations. So we begin with the member of the home team, as it were. Jenna Alsop is the administrator for the Society, but she's also a doctoral candidate at the University of Brighton. But this is a project that comes out of other researches. Her own doctorate is more about amateur film and queer identities. But this is a wonderful way into our question of how the representation of class communities are regionally located. And her tantalising title is £1 Million of Memories, the Material Culture of Leamington Glass. So many thanks, Jenna, and over to you.
Thank you, Claire. So yes, as Claire said, this is some research outside of my doctoral studies. It was postgraduate research that I took, and it unearths an under-researched area of working class history, but also glass history within the northeast of England. So everyone does family history nowadays, states Alison Light, noting that since the 1970s, family history has boomed, a consequence, she suggests, of contemporary mobility in Britain, quote, when fewer families live within a stone's throw of each other. This research forms part of my own family history and will focus upon glass objects made in the Leamington Glassworks in the latter decades of the 20th century. Leamington is a small housing area 5 miles west of Newcastle upon Tyne city centre and sits just north of the River Tyne. Like many areas of the northeast, Leamington had its own glassworks, providing a major source of employment for the local population. Countless members of my own family worked there, including 2 great-grandfathers, 1 grandfather, 2 grandmothers, several uncles, and my father. Today, all that remains of the former glassworks is a large English bond brick-built glass cone, shown in one of the images, standing over 35 metres high and 21 metres in diameter. The Light's suggestion that contemporary mobility is a major factor in undertaking family research could be fairly applied to my own motivation for doing so. Having moved from Newcastle to the southeast in 2006, age 18, my opportunities to visit were infrequent, and each time I did return, something was different, the area less familiar. Losing my maternal grandfather in 2012 piqued my interest in family history, particularly regarding the glassworks, as it is a place I heavily associate with him. My research was inspired by 2 objects owned by my maternal grandmother, 2 clear purple glass ashtrays decorated by a printed roll cipher of Queen Elizabeth II, commemorating the Silver Jubilee of 1977. Measuring 10 centimetres by 10 centimetres by 2.5 centimetres, all glassworks staff were given one of these. As both my grandmother and grandfather worked there at the time, my grandmother owns 2, and now I do. These ashtrays were displayed in my grandmother's living room display cabinet until she passed away in 2019, along with several other tableware objects made in the glassworks. Whilst this study is initially a family history, it is also a local history of the area where I grew up. I wanted to research other residents of Leamington who worked at the glassworks and who also still own associated objects, in order to establish if this was a trend common to the area. This led me to the Facebook public group, Leamington Residents Past and Present, and access to more than 1,500 members' stories and memories of the glassworks. The group conversation threads are predominantly reminiscences of life in Leamington during the second half of the 20th century. It became apparent that most members of the group either worked at the glassworks or knew someone who did, meaning most people have a story to tell. So my research incorporates the production and consumption, for want of a better phrase, of Leamington glass objects, with particular reference to the role women played in both areas. As the majority of industrial history is focused on the role played by skilled male workers, I wanted to highlight the role played by women as the so-called semi-skilled factory workers. However, for the purpose of this paper today, I will focus on the role of women as the consumers. So Cheryl Buckley notes that women interact with design in a variety of ways, and argues that design is a collective process involving groups of people besides the designer. Women play an important role in the consumption of designed objects, and they were the dominant group who discussed the objects in the Facebook group. So this study draws on material culture and everyday life methodologies to examine the relationship between object and owner. Judy Atfield defines material culture as, quote, the integration of artifacts into the social world through the acquisition of social meaning within specific cultural historical contexts. The material culture approach follows objects past their production stage to discover how they are consumed to become, quote, the stuff of everyday life, unquote, and how they are involved in the construction of community identity. Crucially, Atfield notes that interpreting the production and consumption of design is not an exact science. It's not just about collecting the facts, but about exploring theoretical issues of cultural value. As my main focus is the use of never before studied objects by a group of never before studied people, there are few concrete facts that can actually be drawn. cultural value, truths, opinions, and emotions relating to how these objects were made, exchanged, consumed, and their embodied meaning will be prioritised and explored through the conversations members of the Facebook group had. Alternative data collection methods such as social media are useful in scenarios such as this when confronted with a variety of sources of working class history. The Facebook group has proved an invaluable primary source in this context. The glassmaking in Leamington dates back to 1619, and the Leamington Glassworks dates back to 1787. During the Second World War, it produced most of the country's radar tubes and runway lights, and in 1950, a Lynch press was installed to produce components for domestic televisions. The latter part of the 1950s saw a decline in business, seeing virtual cessation of machine work, though hand methods continued. 1962 saw the formation of a new company, Glass Tubes and Components Limited, which manufactured commercial quality, clear and translucent quartz tubing, high wattage lamp bulbs and glass for airfield lighting. A local council journal noted in 1972 that despite mechanisation, much of the work, especially glass blowing, still required, quote, craftsmanship of a high order, unquote. And the journal notes that apprentices would still train to take over the present generation of craftsmen when they retired. Though a method of industrial production, the term craft is often applied to the glass blowers, as it was a method which could not be replicated solely by a machine. It can be argued that Leamington's emphasis on glass blowing in the production of industrial goods, such as bulbs and tubing, and its lack of recognition as a category of craft by design historians has contributed to its anonymity in the historical field, compared to its local and more widely known contemporaries such as Joblin, Sowerby, and Davidson, who focused on press-moulded decorative glass. So the objects of this research comprises not the light bulbs and the components that made up the majority of the Leamington manufacturing output, but the small amount of decorative wares that were produced on a small scale for private use. So like my grandmother, who still owns and displayed displayed her Jubilee ashtrays, several of the Facebook group members and their families still own and displayed theirs. David Ward describes how his father is a smoker, yet the ashtray in his parents' home has never been used. This was echoed by Maureen Lenihan, who recounts the time she once used her mother's as an actual ashtray and was almost cast out from the family. Lynn Taylor and Susan Fisher still own a red and purple ashtray, respectively. Gary Opie notes that at the Glassworks, his dad made the ashtrays and that his mother packed them, adding, he quote, didn't realise that she packed them into her shopping bag. So this casual theft appears to have been fairly common in the works. When I asked my grandmother how she acquired some of her objects, she admitted, quote, well, the odd bit here and there was just taken. Everyone was doing it. The majority of the objects still owned by past and present Leamington residents fall into the category of friggin. Described as a sort of bricolage by the Tyne and Wear County Council, friggin is a colloquial term applied to glass curiosities made by glassmakers to demonstrate their blowing skills and prove their craftsmanship and virtuosity. Friggin objects traditionally included glass top hats, tobacco pipes, bells, swords, walking sticks, shepherd's crooks, and rolling pins. They were made in the workers' spare time from glass left over at the end of the day and were either given as gifts to family and friends or sold on as an unofficial but recognised bonus. The most popular friggin objects are dumps, or paperweights, dating back to the 19th century and encompass a solid piece of glass enclosing arrangements of spaced bubbles, sometimes in the form of flowers or plaster busts of famous people. These dumps continue to be made throughout the second half of the 20th century, and Leamington resident Terry English noted, everyone in Leamington had them. Suzanne Bainbridge's father confirmed that at the end of a run, any leftover glass could be, quote, knocked up into something or another and given or sold on for a few bob. Maureen Lenihan owns 2 paperweights, which until recently, she explains, she still used at her office job. As the paperweights, the 2 most common friggins were fish and swans, pictured in the bottom central image. I think nearly everyone in Leamington had at least one fish, claims Jean Story. Ronald Dodds has 2, and Janice Wallace still displays her glass fish, which was blown by a family member. She also notes that most families in Leamington had one of all colours and shapes. Maureen Lenihan's mother still owns her fish and swans and has continued to display them since 1980. And it's Maureen Lenihan's mother's fish and swans that are in the central image. and it is Maureen Lenihan's aunt and uncle in the right-hand image, and you can see, so it might be a bit small, but you can see the glass fish on the top shelf of the dresser behind them, sort of proudly displayed. And the bottom right image is Maureen Lenihan, and that's her mother's glass fish, and that's a picture of her in the 1970s. So she's got quite a strong collection of Leamington glass. Ken Wheeler highlights the other types of frigging residents of Leamington still own and discuss. I think when the glassworks were still up and running, every house in Leamington had paperweights, swans, yards of ale, glass walking sticks. I even had a glass pool cue. Lynn Whitfield still has her glass walking stick, and Diane Thompson remembers having a walking stick custom made for a relative's 60th birthday. As these objects do not easily fall into a recognised design category, they are problematic to theorise. Traditional consumption theories fall short, as these objects were designed, made and consumed by the same people. Atfield is helpful in understanding the problems of interpreting objects such as those described above. He states, quote, "Things in the lower case are much more elusive and less easy to categorise. Once objects escape the boundaries of categorisation, they become wild, and like the wild cards in packets of cards, can be used to take on different values according to the state of play of the game." End quote. So using Atfield's term, these objects are wild in that they escape the boundaries of categorisation. These objects don't quite fit anywhere. According to Atfield, wild objects defy the definition of good design. They are things, quote, with attitude, a disreputable, wild and dangerous rabble of objects that talk back, end quote. The state of the play of the game, as Atfield refers to it, is worthy of concern in relation to these objects, as emotion and nostalgia have an influence on the embodied meanings, value, and the construction of a local identity. What became apparent when researching the use of these objects is the pride which the owners hold for them as representative of the craftsmanship of the maker, who more often than not was a close friend or relative. The objects hold emotional value, which would explain why people have held onto and displayed them in their homes for so long, often taking pride of place in their living room display cabinets, as shown in the bottom left and right images. These objects transcend taste and fashion. They exist outside the fashion system, as their embodied meaning runs deeper than a passing desire for the next new thing. Maureen Lenihan refuses to ever part with her paperweights. Although probably worth nothing, she stated, they are worth £1 million of memories. My grandmother said she would never part with her glassware, and she did not until I inherited the majority of it in 2019. This is a view also echoed by Janice Wallace, as they hold sentimental value and are part of Leamington history. Sorry, excuse me, I'm just going to mute this. Pauline Cuthbertson's daughter has a frosted polar bear and a frosted elephant, which she inherited from her grandparents who worked at the glassworks, demonstrating the status of the objects as family heirlooms to be passed down. Fred Davis defines two types of nostalgia, collective and private. Collective nostalgia, he claims, occurs when symbolic objects are of a highly public, widely shared and familiar character, which can trigger wave upon wave of nostalgic feeling and can serve the purpose of forging a national identity, expressing patriotism. Private nostalgia, he continues, occurs when symbolic images and illusions from the past, which by virtue of their resource in a particular person's biography, tend to be more idiosyncratic, individuated, and particularistic in their reference. It can be argued that the Leamington glass objects embody both collective and private nostalgia. Each object holds specific symbolic meaning for the owner and will conjure individuated memories particular to their biography, evidenced in Maureen's £1 million of memories. But also, when discussed within the context of the Facebook group, they can be seen to influence, quote, wave upon wave of collective nostalgia, prompting others to reply to conversation threads and share their similar stories and photographs and reflect on the good times. Janice Wallace describes spending her childhood living in Leamington, together with several aunts, uncles, grandparents and cousins. As did most families then, she stated, "You don't get communities like that now." This good old days nostalgia is mentioned frequently within the Facebook group, demonstrating a clear collective nostalgia for the mood and spirit of their childhood. The sense of community spirit that these people grew up with is fondly remembered, and the collective experience of working at and displaying objects from the glassworks can take people back to those times. To use or display a Leamington Glassworks object and to understand its cultural value is to be part of the Leamington community, to take on the local identity and demonstrate local patriotism. Leamington glass is Leamington's heritage. The surviving objects are relics and emblems of community identity, and the cone, which dominates the Leamington landscape, is a monument to the local industry and its workers. Drawing on the work of Walter Benjamin, the Leamington glass object can be said to embody cult value. Benjamin states, the uniqueness or aura of object of art is inseparable from its being embedded in the fabric of tradition. He argues original works of art originate in service of secularized ritual, and that artistic production begins with ceremonial objects destined to serve in a cult, therefore gaining cult status. In creating these frivolous objects, the glassworkers were engaging in the secularized ritual in which their predecessors had also engaged, creating ceremonial objects designed to serve in a cult. When taken out of their traditional context, their cult status or aura is lost, as it is dependent upon the embodied emotion and personal attachment. To anyone unconnected to Leamington, the aura is not present. They are merely anonymous, mute glass objects. Thank you.
Brilliant, Jenna. Thank you so much. And as always, we're sort of celebrating the way in which we would do for the hearing impaired. I'm sure everyone would share that applause with me for you. Now, as those of you who've joined the group before will know, our principle of dialogue is that both speakers present, and then we have a conversation looking at the two sets of research together. So please do pop into the chat any questions that have come into your mind now, so we can pick those up after we've heard from our second speaker, Ruth. But wonderful setting up of our ideas, Jenna, that's great. So it's my great pleasure to introduce our second speaker, Ruth Clifford, who joins us, I think, from Sheffield, but as a colleague at Liverpool. She completed her doctorate at Nottingham Trent in 2020. And I think this comes out of her teaching and her research around fashion and communication. So she'll be talking to us tonight about representations of Indian handloom weaving and their impact on weavers' job roles and relationship with their market. So many thanks, Ruth, and over to you.
Thank you, Claire and Jenna, and thank you for inviting me to speak. I'm sorry that slide is a little bit jumbled and collage-like. I kind of changed my mind on the images at the last minute, but can you hear me okay? Yeah, okay, great, thank you. So I'm going to talk, my paper is sort of reflecting back on my PhD research. So a lot of the field work was kind of 2016, 2017. So it feels like a long time ago now, and obviously I've not been able to travel as much with the recent situation, COVID, etc. So I've since started a new job at Liverpool on the fashion design and communication course. So I'm kind of looking back and positioning it in new disciplines and looking at it from different angles. Have kind of still had conversations with the weavers and things. So in some respects, you know, when I look at it, I'm thinking, oh, is it a bit outdated? But you know, I think some of these things are still relevant, and this sort of it's a kind of like transition point really, and I'm thinking about where I'm going to take the research now. So hopefully that'll make more sense anyway. Okay, so the village of Bujodi, which is where most of these images are taken, it's a village well known for its thriving community of weavers, situated about 9 kilometers from the city of Bhuj in Kutch, Western Indian, who are the weavers there. Up until the 20th century, weavers made cloth for local herding and farming communities in exchange for grains and dairy products. Weaving was done alongside agriculture. When the weavers lost their clients to cheaper machine-made versions of their cloth, some weavers left the occupation to migrate to urban areas or find factory work. For those that have stayed in the occupation, weaving now is a full-time occupation. From the 1970s, urban boutique owners, so from cities in India, as well as government and non-government craft development schemes, intervened to provide weavers with jobs and recognition for what was becoming a lucrative urban market for crafts. Such development or revival efforts were closely tied to India's efforts at nation building and securing a distinct cultural identity following its independence from British rule in 1947. Following the devastating earthquake in 2001, which heavily impacted Bujodi, the number and size of intervention and development efforts expanded with an increase in international funds and a tax holiday from the government as part of the region's rehabilitation. The tourism industry also expanded, and Bujodi is now a popular tourist destination for tourists interested in craft, one of the key selling points of Kutch, as well as other visitors include fashion and interior buyers, designers, collectors, curators, amongst others. In the Indian government's narrative around handloom weaving in India, weavers have been presented as victims of kind of modernization, outdated against new advances in machinery, an unskilled labor force that need to be trained in new technologies, but also as symbols of India's traditional identity and pre-industrial past. So this romantic vision of craft is what tourists want to see when they're visiting the region, and the weavers perform for this vision, and what Laura Kendall talks of, a sort of performing heritage. For Indian and global fashion designers and brands, Bujodi's handloom textile provides an opportunity to bring the handmade, ethical or slow fashion to ethically minded markets. So during my fieldwork for my PhD in Bujodi in 2016, I witnessed an order in process for one of these high fashion boutiques, which was based in New York. I had visited the weavers, the Weaver family before, and several at the time, and both he and his son Nitesh had graduated from the local design school, Kalaraksha Vidyalaya, which was a case study for my research. Nitesh Namori's son was rushing to complete weaving a piece of cloth with strips of old recycled polyester saris. Nitesh's wife and his sister-in-law were cutting the pieces of the saris ready to hand over to Nitesh. There's a bit of a kind of factory line going on in the household. So most weaving is done within the household in the village. As I made to leave, Namori hastily informed me who the order was for. And I looked at the company and later saw that they were selling garments made from woven polyester material. Information on Namori and his family, and this aesthetic, the polyester stripped woven fabrics was very different from what they would usually weave, which was sort of mainly in wool, cotton and silk saris, stoles and shawls for high-end markets, incorporating a combination of the traditional extra weft motives and patterns that are kind of unique to the region, contemporary color schemes, as well as new compositions, but also cheaper acrylic shawls for a local market, which they still continue to produce. I'd not seen them weaving these kind of strips of old cloth before, and it struck me that there was much less skill and creativity involved in this process. It seemed more arduous and tedious weaving process than the ones I'd seen Nitesh weaving and designing before. When I've been on the brand's website more recently, I noticed that there were shots of another weaver's family I'd also spent time with in Bujodi, and that was of master weaver Shyamji Vishram Balji. And it was in a trailer called, in a film that the designer had made along with a filmmaker called Traceability. The master weaver, Shyamji Vishram Balji, is kind of savvy to the craft aesthetic and ethical and sustainable ideals of brands such as Laura Siegel, as well as in India, where high fashion brands draw on local crafts in efforts to express a distinct Indian identity. Shyamji is an advisor to the design school Kalaraksha Vidyalaya, which and the most recent incarnation of the school, Samaya Kalavidya. He's widely travelled and written about in documentation on Kutchi or Bujodi weaving, and he regularly wears hand-woven kurta and shalwar, so shirt and trouser sets. He sees his role as preserving the industry, and he employs over 60 artisans, including weavers, embroiderers, and women working on ancillary activities for weaving, such as warping and spinning. Shamji expresses pride in his efforts to revive hand spinning using local sheep wool, and the community. And he also takes pride in his community's rejection of the government's offer to introduce modernised looms and to weave jacquard cloths, which is a common initiative in government schemes across India to increase efficiency and modernise the industry. This decision was based on an understanding of the more lucrative market in textiles produced on the traditional pit loom, which you can see in the top right here, and utilising the extra weft technique for patterning. So jacquard would be a sort of quicker method of producing patterns, whereas the weavers continue to sort of, it's almost like a hand embroidering on the loom, hand inserting the patterns into the loom. So all these efforts by Shamji and his family, in the top right corner is actually his brother here. And it's interesting because neither of them actually weave themselves now because they've got such a big business. But Rajesh wanted to sit on the loom for this photograph. So it was a kind of performance for the camera, which was interesting. So the decision to reject the new machinery, the jacquard looms, was based on this understanding of a more lucrative market in textiles produced on the traditional pit loom. Sorry, I've repeated myself. And he's also provides charitable support to his employees. So all these efforts have kind of equipped Shamji and his family with this high level of kind of symbolic capital, which is a sort of legitimacy and prestige in the local community. Within the wider craft world and global markets, which he's regularly exposed to, he employs a form of self-orientalism, to quote a concept developed by Sandra Neeson, Jones and Leszkowicz, in the way that he appropriates the Orientalist ideas of traditional craft developed in colonial and post-colonial narratives to take back ownership of his craft and succeed in the market. The image in the middle, so the top left-hand image you see is some of the local Rabari women, which is a local community that were once the traditional clients for handloom weaving, spinning the yarn, and there's a man in the corner winding the yarn onto a hank. So you can see that this sort of setup of Shamji's household he's in quite traditional architecture as well. His house is still using the traditional mud walls, whereas we've got in the middle Dialogue Kudecha, who's I don't know how much you can see from that image, but in the background there's a metal frame loom which stands up from the ground. So it's a slightly more modernized loom than the pit loom, but it's still manual loom, and it sort of takes up more space in the house. So he had a new house built to kind of house that loom. So it's a kind of considered a much more kind of modern house to live in Bujodi. So for many of the weavers, this building a new house is a kind of expression of a visible symbol of their economic success as a weaver. So Dialogue Kudecha was a former employee of Shamji Vishram Valji. He remembers overhearing a visitor tell a friend that the stole she was wearing was Shamji's, but Dial remembered it to be one he had woven. And this was one of his imperatives for studying design at Kalaraksha Vidyalaya, and he's now running a successful business with his son, who his son initially wasn't keen on continuing in the handloom profession, but when he saw the success of his father, decided to keep at it, and is now working in the business and also has attended the design school. So at the time of research, Dialogue's production was small, and he produced high quality pieces that draw on local aesthetic, as well as the Kutchi repertoire in combination with researched concepts based on influences he picks up on his travels. He's become a kind of poster boy for colorature in the sense that this setup is exactly as the Design Institute aimed for their graduates to become small-scale artisan designers, sort of akin to what we might know as designer makers in countries like the UK. I apologise if I'm breaking up. My internet isn't the best at the moment. Amongst a global market, artisans in India and other developing countries with large numbers of craftspeople relying on craft for employment represent sustainability and ethicality, whether in practice or just for show, which according to Elka Gorgal has become part of the core business of the fashion industry. However, the more the demand for artisanal textiles and crafts such as handloom, weaving and bujodi, the more reliance on human labour and the more risk of de-skilling, which is a concept that Michael Hertzfeld talks about alongside his theory of the global hierarchy of value. Dalal Kudecha, as well as other graduates of the design school, expressed concern that if all weavers attend the design school, there would be no weavers left to fulfill increasingly large orders they receive. This reliance on what they call job weavers poses a risk of imitating the hierarchies between designers and artisans that design education was initially aiming to dissolve. So when producing yards of what a machine could make, job weavers' embodied knowledge and creativity is compromised for the sake of maintaining this romantic vision of their craft within the market, rather than a recognition of the artisan who made it and their creativity. Sass Brown claims that a careful balance of contemporary design, artisanship and tradition, fashion industry, which she argues is the best market for global craft. However, only when there's a value shift between making and designing, a shift from the individual designer as being the sole owner of the final piece, and a shift in the perception of the artisan, can this balance be achieved. I've attempted to show that the diversity of roles that weavers might employ in at different points in their career. Many take on roles as social agents themselves and are keen activists for their own craft development, yet they're not fully recognised in wider debates around their craft. Therefore, my argument is that it's crucial that weavers' agency and body of knowledge is recognised on a wider level within global markets, within education, in India as well as globally, and also within government policies. The handloom industry continues to come under the government's Development Commission, but only when it's viewed as a creative economy and relevant to contemporary visions of India, like the IT sector. There's a similar number of people to the handloom sector. Will long-standing sort of dualisms be fully challenged, and handloom weaving be valued as creative and dynamic industry, relevant to both an ever-growing demand for sustainable fashion, as well as local economies and culture. Thank you.